Great to see everyone coming in for this final session of the CGHE annual conference under the heading Higher Education Knowledge for a Plural World. And we hope that our conference program has given life to that notion of knowledge for a plural world. And there's certainly been a lot of discussion of knowledge in the context of diversity and distribution issues. This final keynote, it's a great pleasure for me, Simon Marginson, to chair this session on the university and social imagination. And our keynote speaker is, of course, Professor Keri from the University of Bristol. Now, Keri is Professor of Educational and Social Futures at Bristol and the University of Gothenburg, where she's currently exploring how ideas of the future and of time shape education's capacity to foster personal and collective agency. She's been looking at the relationship between education and futures for 2 decades, with a particular interest in the potential of universities and schools to act as democratic resources for addressing technological and environmental change. Previously, from 2018 to 2020, she was the Zenstrom Professor in Climate Change Leadership at Uppsala University in Sweden. And from 2012 to 2018, she led the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council Connected Communities Programme. It's a £40 million programme of university community collaboration. Her full bio is in our conference program, but I think at this point, let's make the best use of the time. I'll hand over to Keri.
So thanks, Simon. It's great to be here. I'm just going to share my screen. And here we go. So thanks again to Simon and to colleagues for the invitation to speak and for all of the hard work on this conference, which has been just fantastic. So today I want to talk to you about the role of the university in fostering a rich, critical, relational and experimental social imagination that's adequate to the times that we find ourselves in. There's a load of areas in which we might want to exercise this imaginative capacity, from how to address deep inequalities to the decline of democracy. But I want to provide a little focus. I want to look particularly at the role of the imagination and of universities in cultivating it in relation to the question of climate change. Now, before I do that, I just want us to take a moment to cut through those words climate change that get trotted out all the time at the beginning of talks. I want to invite you to just stop for a second and think about when you realized that our world's climate patterns were changing and that this climate thing was no longer an abstract concept, but that came home to your world. What did you see or feel or notice? For me, it was when the dam near my hometown in the Peak District nearly collapsed under the pressure of extreme rainfall, causing thousands of people to have to be evacuated overnight. It was also when the moors of the hills that I love went up in flames for a second year on the run. It shocked me, made me incredibly sad. It also made me think and begin to feel a growing sense of kinship with all of those others who were already losing land and fighting to prevent loss around the world. When was it for you? Climate change isn't a future problem or an abstract technical concept. It's a locally unpredictable lived experience that impacts homes and livelihoods. It gradually seeks out our vulnerabilities and rips them open. It takes different forms in different places, and we are prepared differently to respond. Acknowledging and working against and living with a changing climate will require us to confront our histories, understand our shared and different vulnerabilities, and begin to reweave social relations in ways that open up the possibility of alternative futures. Universities, I want to argue, have a critical role in this process, not only as scientists and educators, but as sites for fostering the imagination. And I want to suggest that this is a role that we're not yet playing to our fullest capabilities. So first, let's get into this question. What do we think climate change is? What are its causes? As Sharon Stein has argued, if we aren't clear about the nature of our diagnosis of the predicament, we're unlikely to be able to envisage adequate responses by higher education. There are four ways of thinking about climate change that tend to dominate public debate and academic analysis, each of which offer different roles for the university. These are the geophysical, socioeconomic, epistemological, and what I call mythic lenses. So the geophysical lens draws on climate science to frame the situation through one key measure, the level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and the material causes and consequences of this increase. This is the lens that offers us climate models and a view of the planet as a system. Such models and systems are useful in pointing out that our current way of life is pushing us towards at least 2.7 degrees warming by the turn of the century. They're even more useful in pointing out that this figure is dependent on technologies for carbon capture and storage that would require 5 planets worth of land. They're also useful in helping us to model and understand what warming in the level of 3 degrees might involve. Last time it involved camels in the Arctic. And in telling us that half of humanity, 3.3 billion people, live in areas that are vulnerable to dangerous impacts of climate change, even if temperatures only go up by 1.1 degrees. This lens also gives us the idea that we can govern global climate, that we can model what's happening, that the planet can be controlled. It's a lens that has foregrounded scientific explanations and technological solutions for 30 years. This perspective has given us not just transformative energy solutions, but also provides the justification for mega dam projects and for geoengineering. It is the framing of the planet as a scientific problem demanding technological and engineering solutions. This way of framing the problem is the one that Boris Johnson mobilised when he gave his welcome speech at the Glasgow COP26 summit in November last year, before flying back for dinner to London with the chair of the UK's leading climate denial charity. He opened his speech by suggesting that it was time to follow the lead of James Bond, a Glasgow native, and to defuse the ticking bomb of climate change. His speech concluded with the following statements: "We have the ideas, we have the technology, we may not feel much like James Bond, not all of us necessarily look like James Bond, but we have the opportunity, the duty to make this summit the moment when humanity finally began to defuse that bomb." The consequences of this sort of story at the summit last year, let's call it the James Bond account of climate change, was a car park full of electric cars, buses and aeroplanes that looked like a supermarket on a wet Sunday afternoon. It led to an agreement that didn't mention oil and gas phase out and that only suggested limited aspirations on reducing coal. It also offered an inadequate commitment to meeting the costs for loss and damage for low-income and developing countries. A second way of making sense of the situation is the social and the economic one. And this is the one that's often mobilized in sociology, critical economics, and climate activists. Climate change here is recognized not only as a scientific and technical problem, but also a problem of society, politics, and economics. This is the perspective that argues, as in the latest IPCC report, that to secure a healthy, livable planet for everyone, we need to transform our way of life fundamentally. Here, the problems are understood as structural and economic. They draw attention to the deep inequalities in emissions production, both historically and in the present, in which the 10% of the world's global population produces 50% of the emissions. That includes us, as academics and our students. This lens draws attention to problems such as the capture of states by fossil fuel interests and society's structural dependence on economic growth. It also draws attention to the fact that the fossil fuel industry has made up the largest delegation at the last climate summit and to the sustained 30-year campaign of disinformation. The third epistemological lens, and it is almost impossible to find an image for this, so this will do, for making sense of the situation, is one which says climate change is caused by a problem of knowledge. In this analysis, modern industrial institutions are seen as inadequate to developing the knowledge needed to deal with the complexity of what we're facing. In the familiar phrase, the world has crises, universities have departments. In this perspective, social, technological, and material factors have to be thought together, and Indigenous knowledge systems need to be recognized as having a critical role to play in deepening and challenging existing scientific and technical accounts. Without respecting and recognizing situated in multiple forms of knowledge that allow us to understand the predicament in all its complexity, this perspective argues that we cannot hope to develop intelligent responses. The final lens for analysing the causes of climate change is to see it as a problem of our dominant belief systems that have divorced people from their interdependent relationship with the other beings of the life world. Here we can see arguments originating in both Indigenous traditions, in marginalised land-based traditions of the global north, and from philosophical traditions in Asia. All of them argue that it is the myth of the separation of humans from other beings that drives extractive and exploitative behaviours, which in turn drives climate change. Without addressing the fundamental myth of humans as masters of and separate from nature, whose destiny is to use our superior skills to achieve supremacy over the world, this perspective suggests that we can't begin to address the current situation. So these four lenses offer us very different and conflicting at times diagnoses of the situation, and they offer us different responses. The geophysical lens, as it's translated into contemporary politics, makes a case for science and technology innovation to address what's framed primarily as an engineering problem. The second, socioeconomic account, argues for rethinking economic assumptions, social innovation, and political action. The third, epistemological critique, leads to calls for dialogue between different academic traditions and with wider society. The sort of demand side approaches discussed yesterday, or the sort of slow science advocated by Isabel Stengers. While the fourth analysis, which we could call the mythic analysis, invites a profound reflection upon the assumptions about who and what we are as people alongside other beings on the planet. Each of these lenses and responses has an important contribution to play in helping to understand the situation. I want to argue today, though, that the processes of confronting and working through this issue also require something else. They require a rich, relational, critical, and experimental imagination. And to explain why, I'll tell a little story. So a couple of weeks ago, I was traveling from France to Sweden. I stopped overnight in Hamburg and went for a drink in a bar that I often go to when I do this journey. It's a really beautiful spot, silver light on the water, ducklings, you know, nice stuff. And as I was sitting there, I started talking with a couple of guys at the next table who'd been sailing on the lake all afternoon. They were insurance and IT brokers. They asked why I'd travelled to Hamburg by train, and when I told them I worked on climate change and education and social transition, one of them laughed, and he said, "Oh, I love sailing." He said, "This isn't a problem to me. Rising sea levels are good for me." Before going on to tell me that climate change was a conspiracy cooked up by Bill Gates, that Trump was probably right about things, and that I shouldn't worry my little head about it all. Everything would be fine. This is a common response I get, particularly from men who would like to stop women asking awkward questions. And as usual, I politely but firmly disagreed with them, and we carried on talking. They wanted to stay on the subject though. They didn't let it go. And after a little while, the loud sailor started showing me a video he'd taken the day before of some of the birds and the sea life by his boat. And he was telling me how delighted he was to see them and how worried he was about the state of their kind of continued survival. And the other guy started telling me how he was trying to ride a bike in the city because he was beginning to be a bit worried about emissions for his kids. And as we talked, it became clear that these men, well qualified, highly educated, affluent, had a rarely admitted love and care for the world that they did not easily express, and that they couldn't express this, not only because it wouldn't be sufficiently macho and fit with their identities, as Martin Holtman argues, but also because they felt that such care was futile, that it was impossible to act on. They were convinced that nobody else really cared about this, that the sorts of social and economic changes necessary couldn't be achieved, and that therefore change wouldn't happen. For them, a future different from rising sea levels and ecological degradation was so unlikely that they were better off numbing themselves to the harms and ordering another beer. This approach also came up in a study that Steve Lewandowski, Ulrich Ecker, and I carried out during the COVID pandemic. We asked 1,200 people in the US and the UK what they wanted from the future after the pandemic, and a clear and consistent message came out. Given the option, more people wanted fairer, more sustainable, more communal, more cooperative societies in future than wanted a return to business as usual. The desire for a different future was in the majority. We also, however, asked, what futures do you think that other people will want? And which ones do you think will happen? And here the results were reversed. In the main, respondents thought that other people didn't want sustainable futures and that they therefore wouldn't come about. More than this, their response suggested a latent unease about whether other people could be kinder, more sociable, more caring, as though the actions during the pandemic were an aberration that couldn't be sustained. These observations are echoed again elsewhere. A recent survey of 10,000 young people across Australia, across 10 countries, reported that 75% of them saw the future as frightening. The lack of desirable images of the future has been defined by some commentators, most recently Jeff Mulgan, as a crisis of the imagination. Johan Rockström and Matthias Klum, leading climate scientists, have argued that the world needs a new narrative, a positive story about new opportunities for humanity to thrive on our beautiful planet. I want to suggest, though, that what these fragments of research are telling us is that this is more than just an absence of positive stories about the future. It's a loss of a richer concept of the imagination, one that is relational, critical, and experimental, one that allows us to conceive that we might make common cause with other people, question the world, and work together to explore how it might be different. As Maxine Green argues, the relational imagination is the capacity to tune into what other people are feeling and needing and offering as a basis for new beginnings in transactions with the world. The relational imagination is also the form of imagination invoked by Paulo Freire in the practice of conscientization, the collective social practice for identifying shared problems and routes to respond to them. We can also see this in the sociological imagination of C. Wright Mills, who draws attention to the shared social problems that are reflected in personal issues. And for the psychologists amongst you, the relationality of the imagination is also recognized by Lev Vygotsky, who understood it as central to interpersonal dialogue and learning. So the fears for the future and the numb sense of impossibility of change expressed by these insurance guys and the respondents to the surveys suggests also a loss of the critical imagination, the capacity to see the world as though it's strange, to approach it with curiosity, and to ask how we ended up where we are today. In other words, to see today as non-inevitable. It's the loss of what Keats and more recently Roberto Unger call negative capability, the capacity to see current arrangements as provisional. In Maxine Green's words, again, we can think of the critical aspects of the imagination as the capacity to disclose a different state of things, to open windows of consciousness to what might be, what ought to be. And this richer conception of the imagination is also experimental. It allows us to break with the taken for granted, to provoke persons to take action together, to transcend the deficiencies and to transform. So if we're going to work out how to respond with others to the predicament, particularly the climate change predicament we find ourselves in, we need to learn to trust each other, to inquire with each other, to experiment with each other into things how things might be different. And this is where universities should come in. We need our institutions of education and culture to help us do this, to offer places of collegiality and inspiration for the 2 insurance brokers drinking their beer in Hamburg, or for the hundreds of people filling in post-COVID questionnaires, thinking that nobody else wants to try to live differently, or the millions of young people who are struggling with eco-anxiety and want to start now with creating different worlds. To that end, Martin Mahoney, Silke Beck and Cassie Robinson, amongst others, have begun to make the case for what they're calling an imagination infrastructure, widely accessible social institutions and practices that foster democratic dialogue, analysis, and experimentation with possible worlds. Cassie Robinson points to the example of a place like Civic Square in Birmingham, which defines itself as a public space, a place to gather, make, create, grow, and organize, as a neighborhood economics lab, an experimental social lab working out how to build resilient, regenerative neighborhoods, and as a creative and participatory ecosystem. Universities should be playing a critical role in partnering with, supporting such initiatives, and in fostering our own. We should be at the heart of the infrastructure of the imagination, fulfilling our much touted remit to act as spaces for public debate, for critical reflection about the world, and for the exercise of freedom. If we're going to play this role in relation to climate change, however, we are going to need to reimagine ourselves. We need to start with our own act of critical imagination, questioning how we've ended up where we are today, recognizing that the way universities are is not inevitable, and forming alliances to open up new possibilities. And this needs to start with a reckoning about our own role as universities in contributing to conditions of ecological degradation and climate heating. So if we imagine that climate change is a fire, how have we in universities been responding? Well, in some areas, we've been doing a really useful job alongside Indigenous communities and others of pointing out the problem and telling people it's happening. We make really good graphs and models, and the work of the IPCC, after all, is the product of a truly international effort. We're also getting good as educators and public engagement specialists in telling students and the public about the situation. And many institutions are now benchmarking their courses against the Sustainable Development Goals. But such activities might increasingly be recognized as a form of terror management doesn't mean that they're not useful. At the same time, however, we must acknowledge that universities have also been doing a pretty good job of adding fuel to the flames. If we look at this through a geophysical lens, from an emissions perspective, there's the undeniable fact that as student mobility increases and as academics emerge goggle-eyed from 18 months of Zoom calls, the carbon costs of the day-to-day life of universities, food, buildings, campuses, and transport are intensifying. And of course, there's a much wider question of the underlying business model of universities and the way in which these work against the Sustainable Development Goals, as Adam Habib covered yesterday. Equally, in wealthy nations, many universities and their pension funds have investments in fossil fuel and related industries. Others rely on strategic partnerships with those industries and have also, as Stuart Tannock's research has shown, partner with fossil fuel industries to write curriculum that shuts down opposition or criticism of fossil industries. Equally, if we take the socioeconomic analysis of the causes of climate change seriously, we also have to acknowledge that many universities are, through the work of some of their business schools and economics department, in fact, also researching how to fund the fire, how to profit from the fire, as well as teaching economic theories and models that keep the fire going. For many universities, business schools remain cash cows that cross-subsidize activities across other parts of the institution. But there is little doubt today that the nature of mainstream economics teaching and research is part of the problem we face in addressing climate change. Those business schools that continue to reproduce students inculcated in economic theory, which treats environmental harms as externalities and humans and other beings as resources for extraction, must be seen as fueling not only climate change, but actively working against the wider Sustainable Development Goals that many of their host institutions claim to support. This is not the only way of teaching economics. We also have to recognize that the imbalance in funding within universities also militates against the engagement with socioeconomic questions in relation to climate change. And indeed, the scientific and technological narrative that allows our current Prime Minister in the UK to present James Bond as an appropriate hero for the current situation is actively encouraged by the dominance of STEM analyses and solutions in our universities. A press release put out just before Johnson's speech, for example, saw Professor Nicole Grobert, chair of the chief scientific advisors to the European Commission, argue science provides solutions. Dr. Xavier Estico argued, history has taught us that science, technology, and innovation bring timely solutions. And just in case we missed the coded message, Patrick Vallance, Chief Scientific Officer for the UK, argued, this has got to be the decade of R&D. We must make sure R&D and innovation are scaled up. The research community here speaks with one voice. Make sure that Q has enough funds and he will invent the gadgets needed to get James Bond out of trouble at the last minute. From the epistemological lens, of course, our publishing systems and promotions procedures work against interdisciplinarity and engagement with other knowledge systems. As Trish talked about in her opening keynote, universities do a good job of maintaining disciplinary consensus and closing down alternatives. And finally, as institutions are increasingly required to sell higher education as a good to increase future income, we are active in fueling economic growth, which fuels climate change. Our students are much more likely to be higher consumers and contribute to greenhouse gas emissions than those who didn't go to university. And teaching sustainability isn't enough to disrupt this. One colleague teaching sustainability courses recently in Sweden told me of a conversation with a student who was asking if they could leave the class early to fly to Stockholm to go to the Black Friday sales. As institutions of higher education then, we are not just pointing out and trying to understand the fire, the situation. We must also recognize that as a whole, we are also adding to it. We're benefiting from it, and we're discussing it in ways that are not always helpful. We are entangled, as are all other institutions of the industrialized world, in the problems we're trying to address. And indeed, while higher education isn't mapped onto Will Stephan's graphs of what he calls the Great Acceleration, there's little doubt that the numbers attending universities globally follow the same pattern. While correlation doesn't equal causation, there is no doubt that the increasing ecological harms have happened alongside increasing higher education. And that, as David Orr has argued, the damage that humanity has inflicted on the planet has come not from the poorest and the least educated, but from those with degrees from some of our finest institutions. We are part of the predicament then. We're not outside it. It's not just business as usual we need in our universities, it is a different approach. We need not only to name the scientific facts of the situation, but to recognize and address the social, ecological, epistemic, and cultural foundations, both in the world and as they manifest in our own activities. In other words, if universities are to develop a social imagination that is adequate to the current predicament, we need to cultivate an imagination that is adequate to the task of transforming ourselves. So, where might we begin? Well, we can start off by looking at how we're addressing some of these harms, and there are people working to do this. The place that most universities begin is figuring out how to stop fueling the fire themselves and get to grip with their emissions. So we've got a whole load of projects, often led by students and green offices, to create sustainable campuses. They include, this is work going on everywhere. It's happening in my own university. Some of the really interesting examples are places like the University of Victoria in Vancouver, which is notable for the commitments that it is making for those geeks amongst you to reduce both scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3 emissions without offsetting. But we're seeing also the development of carbon sensitive transport policies, which was unimaginable just 3 years ago. We're seeing shifts towards vegetarian and local food policies. We're seeing the rewilding of campuses and land management for biodiversity developing. And there's all sorts of networks developing internationally, such as KEYNOTE, ACTS, the Alliance for Sustainability Leadership in Education, and the Association of Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Education. So there's a whole load of work going on. But if we want to recognize that our aim in the IPCC's language is to transform our way of life fundamentally, we can't kid ourselves that simply reducing our emissions and having some nice meadows on the campus are going to be sufficient. We've got more sustainable changes, substantive changes required. So another place that we're starting to see people reckoning with the harm of universities focuses on their role as economic actors. The divestment movement, for example, is a campaign that demands that university endowments, trusts, and pension funds stop funding fossil fuels. This is gaining ground. Even Harvard, which denied this for a very long time, has now got on board. Others are going further, looking at how their endowments might be used for social and ecological benefit. There is a growing fossil-free research campaign to ensure that university research is not furthering fossil fuel interests by greenwashing or laundering reputation. These campaigns are also associated with a growing movement to question how economics is taught in higher education, and it makes the case for teaching economics that matters. It picks up Robert Kennedy's critique of GDP as a reliable measure of economic success and questions the sustainability of an economics premised upon endless growth. Some academic and management scholars are also making this case within their institutions, some at considerable risk to themselves. If we look at one university's recent shameful targeting of critical management scholars. The new economics that these students are demanding is hardly radical. It's an economics that simply recognizes that human activity is part of a wider ecosystem, and it's being taken up by cities from Amsterdam to Barcelona. Another common starting point for universities reckoning with these harms is to shift the focus of universities from spaceships to relationships. In other words, to think about universities' role as actors in the wider community. And we've heard a lot about that in this conference. But specifically in relation to climate action, we can see things like the Living Lands Initiative, where we have got a collaboration and a commitment between universities and local Indigenous knowledge holders and elders to manage the land. We can also see a different approach in the Cleveland Community Wealth Building Initiative. Here we see supply chains for the institution recognized as an important way of achieving local sustainable regeneration. And of course, a key site for critical reflection is the area of curriculum and the role of disciplines more generally. And given the growing concern amongst students about climate issues, we can see many courses and institutions beginning to develop interdisciplinary hands-on programs oriented towards engagement with diverse community knowledges. And here the work of Malaysia's International Islamic University is particularly interesting. Their whole institution approach, it's called Communiversity, combines interdisciplinary programs with hands-on community engagement, as well as processes of deep self-reflection. And it's being trialed over the next 6 months in universities across Malaysia. So all of these are really important moments of reckoning with the modern industrial institution of higher education today. And they're the beginnings of what we might call a reparative process that recognizes the harms and complicity of our institutions in the causes of climate change and begins to clear the way for new practices to emerge. And the point that I'm really trying to make here is that an imagination that doesn't engage with this, that doesn't engage with these histories, is likely to do more harm than good. So I want to turn now to the question of how universities might begin to play a more active role in scaffolding what is being called the social imagination. And over the last few years, we've seen a whole range of activities that are trying to do this. At Arizona State University, for example, we have the Center for Science and the Imagination that brings together artists, authors, scientists, technologists, and community members to create new forms of science fiction that aim to offer, in their words, inspiring, inclusive, technically grounded visions of the future. It was an initiative that was brought into being after Neil Stephenson, the science fiction writer, argued that the world was suffering from innovation starvation. We can also look at things like the Chalmers Challenge Lab, which sees students as critical facilitators for experimental futures thinking at the heart of a network of local stakeholders. And here what happens is that the groups will imagine together a particular desirable future and then use a backcasting process to say, well, how did we achieve that? We can also look at things like Henry Jenkins and colleagues' civic imagination labs at the University of Southern California. And here what we're seeing people doing is using the resources of popular culture to facilitate workshops with community activists and academics to explore how things might be otherwise and to examine the seeds of alternative futures in the present. In one of the projects of my own with Helen Manchester in Bristol, we worked together with people from a whole range of different communities to use alternative futures as a basis for thinking about where our collective agency was in the present. So with the All Age Friendly Cities programme, we brought together representatives of young people and older people's groups to say, what would it take to make a city that met all of their needs and interests? And how can we create common cause across them? And that led to a whole set of recommendations that have been picked up by a number of cities. And finally, one of my favorites is this one. This is from the Klimaginaries project in Lund, which is a fantastic program, which is a really rich source of strategies for the social imagination. And this is just one example of their work. They've developed a tour guide to a fictional city called Notre Dame, which is based in a fully decarbonised Europe in 2045. And it's written as a typical kind of rough guide to the city. It draws on research in sustainable urban development and invites the reader to walk around it, recognizing what's stayed the same and what's changed. It creates a story world in which we can imagine different ways of living. So these projects and others like them are beginning to point the way to the sorts of interdisciplinary, collaborative, imaginative work with communities that might foster a different sort of social imagination. They demonstrate how alternative futures and story worlds can act as a useful shared territory for discussion. There are, however, limits to how far these approaches get in nurturing the sort of critical, relational, experimental imagination that I talked about earlier. And these limits are epistemological and structural. First, many of these activities start with the future rather than the present as the site for imagination. And what this tends to do is to privilege discussions of technology and agency and action. And this sort of swift move to the future and to technological change can shortcut the sort of critical reflection on the causes of problems that I talked about earlier. As a consequence, many of these future-oriented activities struggle to imagine changes in deep social mores or cultural assumptions. And this is a familiar practice when we think about futures and work. William Morris's early science fiction News from Nowhere, for example, was able to envisage a future socialist utopia, but not a world where women were not doing the housework. Cultural critic Mark Fisher today has coined the term capitalist realism to describe the way that it seems hard to imagine futures that operate under different economic and social assumptions. And as a consequence, these sorts of imaginative practices, if we're not careful, risk adding fuel to the sort of technocentric account of the future, which, if the social imagination fails, lends itself more and more easily to geoengineering solutions as a shortcut. So if we want to add to these practices, something else is required that might foster a richer critical imagination capable of unsettling these taken for granted assumptions. Namely, the reconnection of these imaginative practices with a broader reckoning with the way in which we're all, as institutions and individuals, entangled in forms of life that have and are still causing harm. We can see glimpses of this in projects like the Museum of Carbon Ruins by the Klimaginaries team, which locates participants in a story world in the year 2072 in which a low carbon society has been achieved, but then invites them to explore the social and cultural changes, the losses and harms and privileges and assumptions that had to be confronted to achieve that goal. We can also see pointers to a different approach in practices that focus on different forms of storytelling, on history and grief as starting points for the imagination. Feminist science fiction accounts, such as Ursula Le Guin's carrier bag theory of fiction, for example, open up spaces for stories that don't involve the heroic conquest of nature and the other. Joanna Macy's grief work invites the exploration of deep sadness in confronting ecological loss and harm. And the slow, patient, embodied work of the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures collective invites a really careful attention to how we might learn from the ongoing death and decline of the institutions and mindsets that we're living in today in order to weave and reweave human relationships. The second limit that these activities that I've talked about face is structural. All of them, with the exception of the Chalmers Challenge Lab, are project-based and grant-funded. They offer temporary sites for the exercise of the imagination rather than sustained partnership with communities. The work is institutionally vulnerable It's dependent upon enthusiastic individuals and upon continued project funding. If I have learned anything over 10 years of studying and being part of such collaborative projects, it is that such short-term activities tend to privilege engagement with those who are already in the ambit of the university and those whose ways of thinking and working are easily intelligible to academics. The slow, difficult, uncomfortable work of building relationships with those with good reason not to trust universities, with those who have radically different worldviews, with those whose political and social projects might contrast with ours, requires time, good brokers, intermediaries, humility, and the slow development of trust and institutional patience. And finally, these activities, with the exception of the work at the team at Lund, who've done a fantastic, interesting project on their university in the future, are strangely blind to the conditions and institutions of their own production. They rarely work backwards on the university itself as a site of imaginative reconstitution, which is a huge mission. So our challenge then is to reweave the university itself, to build dialogues between those who are fostering these acts of imagination and those, such as many in this conference, who are leading the critical reckoning with the university's own role in shaping the narratives and knowledge that underpin our current predicament. Our challenge is to build the relationships, honesty, and spaces for experiment that will allow us to foster our own imagination. To conclude, though, I want to return to the predicament we're facing. We're living in a world in which, for many people, and in Kyle White's terms, the apocalypse has already happened in the forms of colonialism, deindustrialization, and globalization. And where for others, the reality is beginning to sink in that we have a 50-50 chance of reaching 1.5 degrees heating in the next 5 years, with all of its implications for our children's and our other children's lives. Under these conditions, there is a need for an imagination that is relational, oriented towards tuning in and engaging with other people's views and experiences, critical, able to ask hard questions about how we got here to avoid getting stuck in the same old patterns of thought, and experimental, able to open up with creativity and care to new practices of remaking our world. If universities are to support this, however, we need to reckon with our own pasts, get our own house in order, reconfigure ourselves as a site for hospitality to different views, and settle in for long-term partnership working. This cannot rely on ad hoc, voluntaristic, and project-based approaches. So I will conclude with 2 recommendations about how we might go about making that happen at the scale and pace that is needed. And I'm addressing here the UK context because this is the one that I know better, but there will be other approaches elsewhere. The higher education sector as a whole needs to rapidly pivot towards programs of adult and community-based education oriented towards social learning and social innovation. These programs need to create interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary collaborative research-based learning communities. They must be open to everyone, from those in carbon-intensive industries seeking new jobs, to those without work seeking to create sustainable livelihoods, to those in positions of influence trying to shift whole sectors to their way of working. Second, governments need to redefine how they allocate infrastructure funding, recognizing that for the practice of the social imagination, it is time, people, relationships, the everyday small interactions from food to bus tickets that constitute infrastructural investment. We have to get over thinking of infrastructure just as something we can kick. We need to see 5, 10, 20-year investments in collaborative, community-based partnerships that allow the building of trust, the tackling of hard questions, and sustained collaboration about problems of living. These 2 recommendations start from the assessment that the current situation will not be resolved with more technologies, more mega dams, or more electric cars, but that it requires, as the IPCC report recommends, a fundamental transformation in how we live within the next 5 to 10 years. Such a transformation requires a mature analysis of the reasons for the situation we find ourselves in. It requires a democratic, critical, and experimental social imagination that can help untangle ourselves from the ruins that James Bond and his cronies have left behind. Universities have to be at the heart of that process, not as saviours, but as imperfect, compromised institutions of modernity, who are nonetheless willing to reflect and learn and experiment with the new roles that they might play. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Keri. You've given us a lot to work with, and as Sharon Stein did in the panel on racism, you know, you've given us real blueprint there, something we can make work, something we can implement in lots of different ways. So this is really valuable. I'm going to ask the first question. We've got several people coming through already. After myself, Olga Munn and Piers von Berg, and I think So-Young Lee. And I'm not sure whether Altaf Kadir wants to ask a question. Certainly made a statement. My question is really about other factors, other forces that are colonizing the social imagination, apart from universities. I mean, I make a confession here. My family and I, we sit in front of the TV and we look at Netflix and we look at Prime and we look at other sources of possible entertainment and have a period of time in the day when we come together around the television, very traditional behavior. And we look for things to watch, and we find there is an endless supply of dystopian future stuff about the cataclysm that was unavoidable, or often it's just arbitrary nature. Sometimes it's human-caused arbitrary nature. Sometimes it's human-caused alone, but it's basically about inevitability. There's a subgenre which talks about colonizing other planets or going to other galaxies because the Earth is uninhabitable. And what you get from all of this is this sense of inevitability. A lot of it's coming from the United States, but some of it, there's East Asian variants, there's even kind of Nordic variants, which are usually a bit more interesting. But you know, the common element here, I think, is this way it sort of soaks you in this sense of we're going to go through these processes, nothing we can do. It's just a question of what's left on the other side of the cataclysm. Does this matter? Is it something we can address? Is it something that we should intervene in relation to?
Yeah, I mean, I think it absolutely does matter. I do think it's something we need to intervene in, and I do think, you know, this is part of the context that we're operating in. So, absolutely. So there's a few ways in which I respond to that. Actually, reading history and engaging with history is a really important resource for understanding how change actually happens. And I've heard a few people in this conference talk about theories of change. And this is where I think we need to improve and deepen our understanding. This is something that we need to start working on. How do we actually think change happens? And there's a whole range of different models of that. And at the moment, one of my main concerns is that we're teaching young people in particular that either they protest and government listens, or everything is business as usual, whereas there are so many different strategies and resources for challenging that. So one of the things that I think we need to do is make visible the much wider media culture that actually is available if you look for it. So there's a whole range of media sources that you can look at that tell different stories. The second thing is that we know Maria Ahala's work is brilliant on this, is that simply getting an overload of information is not helpful. What you need is opportunities to build relationships and have the experience of affecting change in different areas, which is why I was suggesting that one of the critical pedagogic shifts we need to make is away from telling people about things towards giving people opportunities to try and do stuff. And we can see that simply increasing your understanding and your awareness that you are working things, that other people are working on things, is incredibly useful. So that's absolutely critical. I'll leave it at that. Those are two responses to that question.
Well, thanks, Keri. Now, can we bring in Olga Munn? Olga.
Hi, yes, thank you so much for a very fascinating talk. So my question that I posed in the chat was, in rethinking and reimagining environmental sustainability of the universities, including UK universities, so how do UK universities work on rethinking their financial sustainability models and reliance on international student fees? And I guess the background to this question is that I'm a doctoral researcher in the department in Oxford, and we frequently talk about, let's say, our responsibilities to the past, colonial past, and racism and ongoing racism, and our future commitments to regarding the climate change. But the way, for example, UK's research is funded in universities, I think, is quite unsustainable in terms of many of the great initiatives are funded through international student fees, which are quite extractive. And when you reference Stuart Tannock's research, I do also actually admire his research and his statements on discrimination against international students. So just, yeah, your questions on alternative financing models. How do we fund innovative research and practices? And
yeah. So this to me is one of the critical questions, all right? So we absolutely, couple of responses. There is a lot of work going on into cooperative models of universities. So drawing on Mondragon traditions, for example, there are some pluses and minuses to that. It's very difficult to fund arts and humanities, for example, on that sort of model. But I think it's about, we need to look internationally at the range of different university models that there are and see and foreground the different economic models. And I'm not seeing enough work on this, actually. I think it's something that'd be great, Simon, if your centre can do some stuff on this. So I think firstly, there's that. Look for the other models that already do exist, because there are some. Secondly, what's our timescale for imagining an alternative? So one of the things that I often find when we have conversations about what's possible and what isn't, is that we get ourselves stuck into this question, what's possible tomorrow? Now, clearly, shifting away from dependence on international students and frankly, extractive student fees for most students is going to be difficult if we want to do it by September. If, on the other hand, we set ourselves a different timeline, the question might be, what would we be able to do if we took 10 years? What would we do if we took 20 years? The question is, what's the direction of travel that we want to go in? And getting clear on that, and then saying, how do we build towards it? Whereas too often our imagination is framed by a sort of presentism. This is the way things are, we can't change them, it's too difficult, let's keep doing other stuff, that locks us in to particular models. So one of the critical things I do when I'm working with students and with others is say, which time frame do we want to work on here? And sometimes those are not compatible with, for example, getting emissions down by 2030. But actually, I think that's one of the problems with the scientific and technological framing of climate change, is that it pushes us into a language of urgency that means that we shy away from the difficult long-term questions. So I'd say think about your temporal framing. And then the other critical issue, and I think Diana's work on MOOCs here becomes really, really important, is what's our model of supporting student engagement, student learning and partnership that doesn't involve us getting on planes, because actually you don't need to be shipping UK researchers internationally. Partners in other communities are entirely capable of doing research. Our job is to build those relationships and to mediate it technologically. So the program that we run at Bristol called the Transforming Education for Sustainable Futures Network, for example, works on exactly that model. We don't all have to get on aeroplanes. We support co-production in local areas and we network using the digital. So I think there's a lot of things that we can do.
Thanks, Keri, and thanks, Olga. Can we bring in Piers von Berg now?
Thank you very much for your presentation. My question, Keri, was in the chat about whether your imaginative shift would lead to rethinking the purpose of university education as a more civic one, and what implications that would have for teaching, which is my interest. You partly answered that when you talked about community-based approaches that were inter and transdisciplinary, with action research directed towards problems of living. And so I wanted to ask you about that idea as to what you see are the challenges of that shift. And if I may, I'm particularly interested in the institutional challenges. In my context, I teach in a law department, and we have very little space in our curriculum to have new things brought in, as we're a vocational degree. And the other challenge I was wondering about is that where we have tried these forms of innovations, it's very difficult to get it to something that is deep learning beyond just a tick box activity that students think they're expected to do as part of, in order to pass their degree. In other words, to really engage their beliefs and values around how they see themselves as part of an interconnected community. Those were a couple of the challenges I've thought of, but I was wondering what challenges you may think of when you were making those suggestions in your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, you touch on several of my favorite topics, not least the question of civic and community engagement. I want to take a step back and talk about the point that you've just raised about students and that perception of how do you get to a deep engagement with this as opposed to a superficial one. One of the things that really occurs to me is that we don't have mechanisms for recognizing that universities are a rite of passage, that they are a moment for becoming grown up, okay? So one of the things that I think we should be doing, and I haven't managed to find a university that will let me work with them yet on this, is I think we need to fundamentally change the way we induct students into the university in the first 2 to 3 weeks. So we give them hours on using libraries, you know, this is what study skills looks like, this is how you can find stuff. We need some deep philosophical conversations with them at this point, which is, you've just turned up here. What is this about? Okay, what does it mean to be a student? Now, this is assuming that we're still sticking to 18 to 21-year-olds. We've got a whole different conversation if we're thinking about adult education. So I would foreground that. And I think we need to recognize that we actually have very few rituals in our society to support our students to understand the complexity of living in the world and the challenge and confronting that challenge of what it means to grow up. And that is about engaging with others, that it is about that relational imagination and the difficulty of that confrontation. I think Biesta has been writing about this recently in a useful way. In relation to your curriculum and making time and space, well, there's a bit of me that wants to say you're in charge of your curriculum, and I am going to deny that. I mean, I suppose one of the questions I would say is, again, lengthen your time scale. Think about who you'd need to talk to in order to be able to shift what you did. All right, so if you're doing it in September, it's going to be difficult because you're going to be working with existing frames. If you believe that this is the right way to go, who do you need to build alliances with and talk with so that over a sustained period, we get better at doing this? And I think this is really critical for all of us and for our students, is that we develop, I call it a stubborn imagination. It's not about, if we can't do it tomorrow, we don't do it. It's about, this is going to take a bit of time and it's going to take some effort. I've got loads of, the risk with the civic university thing is, I mean, I'm a big fan of the civic university as an agency for pushing universities to speak and think about who they're going to engage with. I think a little bit, it can be, you know, we're rocking up to save you, which I don't think is what we need in this situation. We need dialogue, we need listening, we need understanding who we've excluded, and we need to understand where our harms have been in the past. So I think I would say civic university with humility and excellent listening skills is probably where we need to go.
Thanks. Thanks for the question, Piers, and thanks, Keri. Can we bring in Altaf Kadir, who's had a couple of comments in the chat? You will have to unmute.
Oh, hello. Thank you very much. I'm very happy I'm contacting you from Canada. Keri, you have said the things that I was looking for a very long time, that how you can put the multidisciplinary factors together, and you have very well explained this today. So I'm very thankful. I'll contact you through email. Keri, I was reading in the book about environmental studies by Mark Stern. It says that despite what many people think, scientific facts don't change people's minds when cultural commitments are in play. In multiple studies, researchers have found that increasing scientific knowledge is not consistently linked to the acceptance of the existence of environmental risk, page 81. So I'm thinking that can universities start courses about environment, which will include cognitive environment, social environment, psychological environment, physical environment, all forms of environment. So our consciousness and awareness is working in multiple ways that we can increase public awareness, and universities can play a pivotal role in this.
Yeah, I'd agree. Not only is there evidence that the information doesn't make much change, but sometimes it makes things worse. People can become a lot more apathetic. So absolutely, we need to create much more multidimensional programs. I would say there is a 20, 30-year history of environmental education and education for sustainable development that has been working on this for a really long time. So we have to stop thinking like this is a completely new thing. We don't need to start from scratch. I would point to Hela Lot-Sisitka's work in South Africa at Rhodes as probably a really fantastic place to start if you're wanting to address those sorts of questions. So yes, I'd agree with you. We need completely different approaches. What I would really like to see is our engineers, our artists, our humanities scholars, our scientists and our social scientists being brought into conversation around problems of living. So, because I'm not against all forms of disciplinary knowledge, so it shouldn't be mistaken. What I really think our challenge is to allow us to use those lenses in different ways and to think what their limitations and their strengths are. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Keri, I very much regret that we've reached the end of our time. And let me apologise to Sayong, to Golo Henseki, Samantha Bhattacharya and Diana Laurelard, who had interesting comments, all of them in the chat, and we would have benefited from another 20 minutes or 30 minutes of discussion with you, Keri. I mean, this is really valuable. Your paper is now available, which is great, and we should all get our teeth into it, I think. But it remains for me to thank you very, very much for a great keynote at the end of our conference. And I think everyone's nodding and agreeing. So, yeah, I see little claps appearing, and yeah, well done. Colleagues, it remains for me to say a very small number of words at the close. It's been, I guess, a vindication of the importance and value of higher education, hasn't it? Learning, knowledge, sharing that process for 2 days. It's gone really quickly. A lot of good listening and a lot of good dialogue. I mean, the irony of it is that many sessions we end up saying we need to talk more about this in future. But that's not a bad thing. I mean, I think that a lot of what we do is about talking in a relational context. That's what education and probably social living is constituted by in many respects. And what this kind of occasion does is it concentrates the discourse. It diversifies our thinking in an intense way over 2 days. It triggers many relationships, and the ideas flow. It's a very good format, and I think that this shows what the internet can do. Our capacity to bring in people from all over the world. 70% of our registrants were from outside UK. I think the format's worked really well, and we've learned how to operate it primarily, of course, thanks to Trevor. We had 16 sessions, 41 speakers, about 1,600 single sign-ins, people from 52 countries. Trevor's going to publish the list, the country-by-country breakdown of our 1,198 delegates in the next 24 hours or so. Today's sessions, we had 142, 108, 117, then we had a combined 97, and then a combined 95, and then a final number of about 95 in Keri's closing session. So these are tremendous attendances. Let me say a couple of things in thanks. Of course, above all, our Director of Communications, our DFC, Trevor Trehan, who's really held this together all the way through, planned it, thought it through, structured it in a clear and simple way that everyone else can use, and then was sitting on every session, managing people's PowerPoints if they weren't coming onto the screen for themselves, and of course handled a huge infrastructure of communication prior to the actual conference itself. Carly Brownbridge sat alongside him or took the work that he was doing when we split the sessions, and Susie has also helped with that. The chairs of the sessions, The CG researchers have all contributed markedly throughout this this conference. I want to thank, of course, all the speakers, our brilliant keynotes, Trish, Adam, Peter, and then finally Keri. But let me make a personal thanks to Claire Callender, Paul Ashwin, David Mills, the deputy directors in CG, who play such a central role in our thinking and the execution of it, and Alice Wanchar, who's leading our next centre bid, also a central player in what we do. And I want to personally thank Shin James and Lily also, and Eliza at Oxford. Next year, I think we'll probably be running a double conference, which will involve a face-to-face conference, all going well, and an online conference, probably for one day rather than two. So we'll have a strong UK focus with some internationals coming in for not a lot for our face-to-face conference, but it'll be tremendous to have a face-to-face conference. And we'll also have another online conference. And of course, we'll continue to run webinars twice a week between now and then. And we'll continue to I'm sure, have great papers in those webinars. All of it will be up there on YouTube. All of the conference will be there, like our webinars are already there. Remember that we publish working papers. We're moving towards 100 of those over the life of CG and other publications, including books. We also hope to secure funding over the 2023-2028 period to pursue another 5 years of this kind of work. That process of constructing that bid is going on at present. And by the time we meet next year, we'll know, I guess, whether we have funding of that kind. So that a lot of work will go into that in the next 6 months, and it's being led for us by Alice Wanchar and Paul Ashwin. So I guess it's sadly, we reached the end. Thank you all for staying, and really look forward to seeing you in our webinars and at our conference next year. Colleagues, thank you for a wonderful set of work well done. Applause all round. Bye for now.